Welcome to La Trobe University. My name is Jan Libich, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor Paul Frijters from the University of Queensland. Paul, welcome.
It's great to be here, Jan. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you for coming. Paul is not only a great teacher, and we'll be talking about teaching a lot because our agenda is the first year crash course in macroeconomics. But you're also a very prolific researcher. You've been, just to name one of the awards, you've been awarded the 2009 Best Australian Economist under the age of 40. So hopefully we'll get to enjoy your insights. Now, let's start with the big picture of what macroeconomics is about. And there's this perception that it's really dry and boring. It's all about curve shifting and definition. Is this accurate?
I think not. I think that macro is one of the most exciting areas because it's where economics has so much power, right? If there's any area of economics where what we economists think is basic policy almost everywhere in the world is what we economists say about macro, right? So economic thinking on inflation drives interest rates. It drives what everybody pays for their mortgage. It drives money creation. So in interest rates, but also in recession and boom cycles, when it comes to priming the pump, when it comes to the whole debate about how rich we are, long-term investments, what the role of government in the economy is, economists are basically driving the agenda. And so it's one of those areas in economics where we can be boss. And where politicians defer to economic expertise. So there's the excitement of being in charge about macro for economists.
So you're basically saying it's not some abstract kind of curve shifting, but it's about human behavior, what people do, how they decide, and the kind of welfare implications.
Sure, and it's also an area where you see the results of abstract thinking, right? So the ideas in macro, as the ideas in any social science, will sound a little bit dry and abstract to the outside world, but it's nevertheless
now are probably nodding.
But it's nevertheless those ideas that drive what is generally thought in the population about how things go and what drives political thought as to how things should be organized at the macro level. So it is both, right? It's the abstract world which is built up of an understanding of human behavior, which in our institutions has become the way that we now run our economy.
Okay, so you're saying that no curves or definitions will be harmed while we're recording this interview. Now, let me maybe make clear that what we're trying to provide here is a crash course in macroeconomics, and we're hoping for a fun crash course just to show that. That it can be fun. So how does macro actually differ from microeconomics?
I would say that macroeconomics differs from microeconomics mainly that it deals with bigger questions. If we think about how to explain macro to students, we always talk about it as if it is micro, right? We talk about an economy as if it is a farm, as if it is made up of 3 or 4 individuals trading with each other. But it's not really how we think of macro when we're giving policy advice. It's more how we can best explain the advice that we have and how we introduce people to macro concepts. But at its most fundamental, macro is about the analysis of big picture questions of, what is the optimal rate of interest? Should government spend more? Should government spend less? Should government be worried about housing bubbles? Various questions of macro are really macro questions. They are not, what does Jan Libich pay for the supermarket for his goods? But it'll nevertheless be how we explain inflation, right? As to, well, Jan pays now more than he did last year, and that's what inflation is. So we try and bring it down to earth when we explain and try to think about it, but at its core, it's not really about individual behavior. It's about trying to understand what all the interaction between millions of people leads to at the aggregate level.
Okay. Now, have you heard of Yoram Bowman? He's at the University of Washington. He's the world's leading stand-up economist. And the only one
yes,
for that matter. And he actually, when he was commenting on Greg Mankiw's 10 Principles, and that's the textbook we use in this class, he was, which is different from the textbook you wrote, which hopefully we'll talk about a little bit later. He basically summarized the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics by saying that micro is wrong about specific things, whereas macro is wrong about things in general. Is this accurate, or is he too pessimistic? pessimistic or too optimistic, maybe.
Well, as the old joke goes, right, economists have predicted 9 out of the last 4 recessions. So I think it is very true about economics in general that we're not so great at predicting what's going to happen next. And our theories are, at every level, slightly wrong. But for me, this is almost the great thing about economics, that we try our very best to give a fuzzy answer to an imprecise question. And I wouldn't want it any other way, right? So there are those who belittle economics for that, who say, now look, it's not exact. You cannot tell me what interest rates will be. You cannot prove that this is what we should do. All you can give is a vague reasonability argument that on the basis of historical analysis and the way we now view the economy, that roughly this and that may be the best thing to do, but it may not. And many people put us down for that. But for me, that's the great thing about economics, right, is as to vaguely muddling on. And I love it for that, right? That's sort of the challenge, to then come out with a better muddling through than the previous muddling through. And so all the dogs who bark at the caravan who say this is not exact, I sort of, fantastic, we don't have to worry about what they say then, right? They're sort of off the debate immediately because they're looking for something that economics can never be.
This is this old joke that springs to mind about why God created economists, to make weather forecasters look good. I think so you're basically saying this is wrong, you know, that's not the right way of thinking about economics.
Well, for me this is an empirical question, right? At the start of the 20th century there were economists who were like physicists. They built huge models of thousands of variables and went out and measured everything in the hope that we would be as exact as physicists about our predictions. And maybe in 1900 this was a reasonable thing to try out, but it's failed dismally, right? It's gotten us absolutely nowhere, these big models. And we've not gotten any better at them in the last 50 years either. But nevertheless, the advice that we've geared to in the last 20, 30 years is a lot better than the advice we gave 70 years ago. There are a lot more economic problems then that we managed to avoid now. And so we have learned. We've learned what the mistakes are and roughly why they were mistakes and why not to repeat them. But as to what's going to happen next,
so you mean the advice some economists have been giving before the global financial crisis?
Well, some advice before the global financial crisis was great. Let me give you an example of great advice which really swayed the day. Right, one of the mistakes we made during the Great Recession of the 1930s was to cut trade ties with other countries, right? Countries sort of reneged on their promises to other countries, both in the bonds that they held of each other, so the amount of money they owed each other, but they also started to actively put up more and more import barriers, making it harder for countries to export towards them. And this was a beggar thy neighbor policy. They all put up barriers, and this led to an enormous collapse in trade, which aggravated the recession completely. Now, the same reflex was there in the global financial crisis. You had unions saying, we must protect local jobs. You had local industry shouting for this. And in
a lot
some
of
cases,
voices like that in the United States.
The United States put up huge import barriers for solar panels, right? If you think about something funny, right? The whole global warming debate is predicated on trying to find the cheapest solar panels, and the Americans just stopped them getting there.
I wish I could laugh at this.
But by and large, this worked, right? The politicians resisted this because mainstream economic thinking so firmly says this is a bad thing to do. So we've resisted the temptation to do this to the same degree before. And this is where economics has come to the fore. In the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, we all said, oh no, don't do this again. This would be a big mistake. And we didn't make a mistake, which is why Australian GDP has gone up in the global financial crisis, because we are the big winners of global trade flow. So we're one of the beneficiaries of mainstream macro thinking.
Let me start with the long-term perspective on the economy. I think that's always the way that every textbook should start, because otherwise the students can't see the forest for the trees. So what are the major long-term macro concepts?
Well, the major thought in economics about the long term is that you are as rich as you produce, right? And so the whole economic debate about what makes us rich in the long term is how many production factors you build up. So we pretend that in the long run the economy is a little bit like a farm, or a little bit like a group of businesses, and it's just a matter of how productive they manage to become. So it's all about long-term investments into how much we know, which is human capital, long-term investments into how big these farms are, how many buildings, how good that the machines are, and that's captured in the notion of capital and then the notion of technology, and in the interaction between everybody, namely all the suppliers, all the clients, the overseas people, which allows us to coordinate, and this comes forth in the notion of networks. And so with those kind of basic production factors, you can build on. You can then start to say now, what affects the cost of capital? What affects the cost of educating people? And you can have second round production factors. You can say now, parliaments are good because they reduce the cost of doing business with each other. They reduce the number of people who smash each other's brain in. And you can then say,
who would do that?
Trust is good. Well, go back 500 years, many people were doing that, right? And you can say now, look, trade barriers are bad because this makes it harder to have networks, makes it harder to specialize. It means that we all do simple things instead of do the things that we're actually best at. And you can go on and on and on in that, right? The long run perspective in macroeconomics is that we are as rich as we are productive. And we've got pretty good ideas as to what makes us productive. And the mainstream advice as to how to become richer as a country is exactly the policies that countries now becoming richer are enacting. So you look at China and India today, the two big emerging powerhouses, they're making huge long-term investments in education, right? The number of years of education amongst the Chinese has risen about 3-4 years in the last generation or so. And similarly in India, primary school education is really spreading, secondary school education, capital investments are shooting off the planet.
So I mean, human capital is so important, and there's a lot of research that shows that, all this endogenous growth literature. Should we, is that an argument for providing free education, even at the tertiary level, or what,
Well, there comes a point at, of course, which more education is no longer useful because you're spending more years in education and less years being productive. So there's always an opportunity cost to being educated. And the jury is always out as to whether we've reached that point in a place like Australia and the US, but it's clear that they've not yet reached that point in a place like China and India. So for them, there is a clear benefit to the government investing in it because individuals don't have enough money to spend on this, right? They just can't afford to wait so long for the benefits of education to come around. But in a place like Australia, most investments are, of course, made by parents and students. Right? These students here for us make the major investment in their education by spending time learning economics rather than having an extra couple of hours in their jobs. Right?
And so one of the things that we need to talk about when we talk about the long-term picture is how whether this growth that we've seen recently, and one thing we should say is it's a very recent phenomenon. It basically started 250 years ago with the Industrial Revolution. We've had thousands of years of virtually no growth. But, has this actually benefited everyone or most people, or has it been the selected few, as some of the, 99% movement would argue? What happened to poverty over
Yes,
that period?
well, I mean, I'm in the camp of people who sing the praises of economic growth, right? As you say, continued economic growth decade after decade was an unheard of phenomenon before, right? You had growth in particular regions for a while and sort of very slow incremental growth over a long time. But now we've been growing 2% for more than a century. And if you go back 2.5 centuries, we've sort of been on the steady 1 to 2% growth path. And this has been associated by tremendous improvements in everything for the whole population. So life expectancy has gone up. Why has life expectancy gone up? Well, we can pay sewage for everybody, vaccination for everybody, blood thinners for almost everybody. Hygiene has improved off the scale. Our local environment has improved, which has helped both the quality of life and health again. Literacy rates have gone up. Everybody gets a chance at reading and writing in our societies. People no longer die of poverty, not just in our country, but throughout the West, and indeed most of Asia, most of Latin America. Die of poverty to the degree that you are threatened by dying of starvation is basically unheard of. And you see the same phenomena in the up-and-coming economies, right? So At a world level, dire poverty has reduced an awful lot. Infant mortality has reduced. Why? It is reduced in China, basically been wiped out in China. It's reducing very rapidly now in India. It's reducing in the last pockets in Latin America and even in places in Africa that are growing. So economic growth, in my estimation, has really risen humanity from the dregs to a much better place. We now all get older, we're happier, we don't have to fear as much crime for our kids because violence has also gone down. We trade with each other instead of kill each other. And I would causally link all those things together.
So what does the future hold? I mean, you mentioned China a few times, and there's some very good economic reasons and theories that predict that the Chinese growth that we've seen recently cannot last. Same thing that happened in Japan and some other economies. So can you just outline what theory it is and whether you subscribe to it?
One of the theories of Chinese growth that is in the back of people's mind is that they will not be able to be that much more productive than other people who have sort of made all the investments into education and factories already. So the main theory, which says that Chinese economic growth must at some point stop, is a notion of a technological frontier, right? That things can only get as good as they are in the most rich countries at the moment, and after that, the growth of 10%, which the Chinese have had for almost 30 years, must come to an end. And I certainly subscribe to that. China still has a lot of growth left. If you look at their educational investments, they can still increase a lot. Their road network can improve a lot. There's a lot more population, which is not really yet used in the modern sector. So I'm one of the people who would say growth in China can keep on going for another 15 to 20 years easily. But after that, I do expect it to sort of level out, just as other Asian countries have leveled out. And they have historically leveled out at about 2/3 to 70% of US per capita GDP. So that they're not quite as rich as the Americans because the economy has sort of structural problems, and that's also true in China. So I don't expect them to be as rich as the Americans per person. But at 2/3 per capita GDP of the Americans, the Chinese economy will be 3 times bigger than that of the US. So it is a clear expectation that China will become the world superpower this century, and probably won't be overtaken by India until maybe the end of the century, if India can stay together.
Now, would you just to summarize it for the students, what you were talking about in terms of the technological frontier, we presented as the diminishing returns to capital, kind of the idea that you just invest more heavily into machines, but then the productivity of each additional physical capital is going to kind of level out over time, and that means that the growth should eventually slow. And we haven't mentioned any of those political constraints that are facing China, and we're not going to go there. But if you're interested, Paul's actually had a series of blog posts on economics.com.au on the politics of China and what the future holds. So I would
thank you for that advertisement.
No, I think
I also run a research group on China, so I encourage you all to look it up.
So, but it's not only in China. It seems that there's a lot of voices that the growth in countries like the United States is over, or at least it's going to slow down. I mean, Robert Gordon has had some recent articles on this. What do you think about this?
It is very hard to predict the future of economic growth in general if we're talking about centuries to come, because one is talking about the unknown of technological improvements. What one can say is that historically speaking, the last 50 years has had higher growth than the sort of the 1.5 century before that. So what we do know in a very long time scale horizon, i.e. the last 2 centuries, that growth overall has actually been increasing. So if one just thinks of it as a sort of keep going on the trend line, then one would say that growth probably won't come to an end because there are still huge technological areas to go, right? Medicine can still improve beyond all recognition, right? We can become half robots and maybe live a lot longer. And
I thought you already were kind of longer.
Who knows?
That's the head, I think.
Who knows? But there are great medical improvements, IT improvements are happening all the time. Automation is likely to happen all the time. The use of robots in everyday life has a huge potential future. So there are clear areas where we all expect economic growth to come from technological improvements.
But I mean,
as to the far future, it's very, very difficult, right? Well, but I don't expect growth to really reduce.
Basically, the kind of technological advances that we've seen in the late 19th century, like running water and sewage and that medicine and so on, this is we've kind of depleted these and all this technological progress that we've seen on the ICT front hasn't really been that kind of satisfactory in terms of raising our productivity. Whether you have iPhone 4 or iPhone 5, does that make such a big difference in terms of our productivity?
I think that's a little bit short-sighted as to the notion what productivity is, right? If we think of productivity as improving people's lives, as building things that we want more than the things we already had, then the slope of human improvement is still almost linear. So we are still, in the last 10, 20 years, increasing our life expectancy at an almost linear rate. It is quite amazing, but it's truly happening, that there are still huge advances to be made. And the notion that, the end of the 19th century, that was the real era of progress. That's when things happened that were really of benefit, and it's sort of taken us half a century to work it through, and now we're just twiddling at the edges. I see no real evidence for that whatsoever, right? Our ability to build cars quicker has gone up and up and up and up. Computers, the cost of computers has gone down and down and down. And just think of the technological marvel that you and I use every day in terms of our little iPhones, right? If you go back 20 years when supposedly technological development would have been finished, that same iPhone would have needed a whole truck full of stuff. And now it's in this teeny-weeny little thing. Right? And so what does he mean that there hasn't been technological improvements? You can hold the technological improvement in your hand and just reflect on what would this thing have been possible 5 years ago? What would I have needed 5 years ago to get the same thing? Well, it's just beyond recognition how much we've advanced.
Okay, so, some people would argue, even if we accept that the long-term drivers are untouched and alive and well, some people would argue that all this growth and all this increases in prosperity haven't actually made people happier. And you've done a lot of research on happiness. So what can you say about that?
Well, it is definitely a stylized fact within the happiness literature that in a country that is rich like Australia or the US or much of Europe, there has not been an improvement in how happy we are from year to year, right? So in Australia, we're close to an 8 on a 0 to 10 scale, and we've been close to an 8 for a very, very long time. And we are expected to be close to an 8 for a long time still. But there are two things to say about that for the long-term future. One is, of course, that if you live longer, well, then you're an 8 for an extra couple of years. And so even if you accept the argument that there's unlikely to be an improvement in happiness per year, just the fact that you enjoy happiness for more years is a direct improvement from a happiness point of view.
Well, unless the 2 years are actually you lying in bed and they artificially keep you alive.
Yeah, but they're not. And so the stylized fact that happiness levels are constant also includes this happiness levels at older years. And in fact, the group which is almost happiest in Australia are the very old people between 60 and 75. So the stylized fact of when people are happy is not that they're happy when they're young and they're miserable as death approaches. That's only true for the last 10 years. But for, retirement is almost the happiest period in people's lives, particularly in Australia.
Well, the current old...
It's an interesting phenomenon.
The current elderly, I think, have reasons to be happy.
They do.
And there's one of the challenges that people also talk about it in terms of future growth, that we've had this demographic trend towards an aging population, meaning that we're going to have fewer people paying taxes in the future and a lot more people receiving pensions and healthcare. And that's going to lead to some major fiscal problems. In fact, some countries, many European countries, are already feeling the pressure now. So is it not something that you think may threaten future growth and future prosperity?
Well, one of the great things about economics is that every problem is also an opportunity. So let me turn this around, right? And let me hence talk about it in entirely different ways, right? One of the ways you can interpret the notion that there'll be less young people and more old people is hence there's going to be more job for young people. And particularly in Europe, unemployment amongst young people is quite high. So you're now talking about a demographic shift which will improve their chances in the labor market. And I should be worried about this. Why?
No,
I clearly should not. And so for a long-term perspective, this, in fact, is going to be a good thing for the junior generations, and it's not really a problem on the world scale either, because there are plenty of young people being born. They're just not necessarily being born in the richest country. But that just means that we will buy services and direct products made by young people for old people from poorer countries. And this is already starting to happen, right? We're starting to farm out health services to India, and we're starting to buy in all kinds of holidays which are offered by young people for older people.
So look, don't get me wrong.
Economists
I
are not
don't think
worried
there's a
about
problem with the demographic change as such. The problem is that the setting of fiscal policies in most countries, especially European countries, is based on this pay-as-you-go system, where you basically take money from the currently working and you give it to the people who the retirees, basically. And if you're going to have the group of retirees going to be 3 times bigger than it is now, and the group of taxpayers is going to be a third of what it is now, and you're already struggling now. Then that's a problem, and we see what happens in Greece when a country hits the wall, the fiscal wall. So this is kind of what worries me, and I'm not seeing enough of a change in Europe along these lines. Dealing with the, it's all about the banking sector, it's all about the short-term problems, but seeing the long-term demographic problem is
I agree with you that there is a transition path, right? As economies get used to the fact that there are fewer young people, and hence that the systems which were predicated on there being many young people you could tax a little bit to fund the few old people has to go, because there are now many older people and fewer younger people. But you can see the adjustments within Europe taking place, right? So there are countries in Europe which don't have a pay-as-you-go system, but a prepaid system. This is true for the Netherlands, for instance, where there are huge investments on behalf of the elderly via general pools. This is also true for Australia, which is also why Australia doesn't have to worry so much about this at all. But in all the European countries, you see, for instance, shifts in the pension age, right? So you see a move towards letting people work for longer as they age more, and hence, a larger part of that whole life will have to be spent working, which is logical, right? If you're going to live for longer, then you've got to work for a little bit longer as well with these added years. But you see tremendous changes within the pension system in Southern Europe. So in Italy, there's been an enormous pension reform, which to a certain extent cheats a generation, right? So there will be a generation of people who grew up and who are now sort of in the 25 to 40 range, who are royally stuffed in Southern Europe, right? It's a technical term, stuffed. They truly will be the losers of this, because they will not enjoy the benefits that their parents will have enjoyed, and they know they're not going to benefit this. And you see tremendous adjustment problems, right? Really good people are leaving Southern Europe because they don't want to pay for the next generation and then pay for themselves as well. And this is a very, very difficult problem. And the obvious solution is not pretty, but it's being taken in most of Southern Europe, which is to sort of cheat the elderly, right? They were promised they were going to have a high pension, and their pension is being cut all over the place, particularly in Greece. A halving or something like that has happened in Greece to the pension, so they're being cheated out of what they thought they were going to get. And the youngsters are now also finding that they have a much tougher life. And this is leading to a real problem. But the adjustments are there. This is a temporary thing.
Look, the pension system, I agree that we have a good template of how to deal with it. I mean, Australia has done a pension reform quite a while ago, and it's been working well. But the healthcare seems to be the bigger picture. And no one really knows how to transform that. And we see from the US that basically spends double the amount of GDP on healthcare as other countries, that going all the way private is maybe not the right way. But
it's a shining example of what not to do so far.
But let's maybe, this is kind of too much, too hard an issue for us to tackle. But I want to go back to the GDP and how it, whether it actually is a good measure of happiness. And we can't go past this famous quote from 1968 by Bob Kennedy, who said that the GDP doesn't measure the strength of our marriages and the beauty of our poetry and our courage, By the way, you have to have a lot of courage to be wearing a hat like this. This is actually, I need to say, this is a present from us to Paul for coming to this interview.
That's my bribe.
That's
right.
his bribe. Yeah, we all need incentives. But he actually, in this quote, he was also talking about kind of depleting the environment. He has something about our rivers and our natural wonder. And many people think that that all this economic growth has actually been fueled by just abusing the environment. So is it a necessary condition? Do we really, for growth to happen, do we need to kind of just abuse the natural resources, or can we have growth without that abuse?
Well, there are two distinct points here, right? One of your questions is GDP a great measure of how a country is doing? And I would say, no, it's not the best measure, right? I'm definitely one of the people who thinks that happiness is a more important outcome than money. And money just goes into happiness, right?
You're writing a book kind of along these lines.
Yes.
It has some funny title.
It covers many areas. It doesn't actually cover this area much, but if you want me to plug my book, it's on an economic theory of greed, love, groups and networks. And so it does deal with the human condition. But it does have the notion in it that GDP is not the only measure of how well we've been doing. But I would, as an economist, say that the pursuit of more GDP has been good for the world as a whole, right? It has helped us overcome many of the previous problems we've had with violence, people dying young, of starvation. It's helped us with overcoming illiteracy rate, dire poverty. So I would be one of the people who sings the praises of GDP in previous eras. But amongst economists, it's been recognized for a long time that GDP doesn't measure everything. It has, for instance, never measured the hugs that parents give each other, or the smiles that they get from their children, or the sunshine that shines on their back. And nevertheless, these are things which are worth something to us. We are willing to pay for them if we wouldn't get them for free. And hence there have been long debates about what else to measure, and I'm one of the people who would say, well, we should have a kind of a gross national happiness type thing to aim for, right, as the thing that our national policy should be about. I think it'll be difficult because I think that our societies are used to thinking in terms of more goods as the thing to have, but there is a constituency for at least also measuring how well we're doing with happiness. So that's the measurement thing. Then the second question of whether we as humans are sort of using the environment, definitely we are, right? There's no denying that more and more of the world's natural resources are being used for us, right?
But is it done in a sustainable way? Or?
Well, some things are clearly not sustainable, right? We're going to run out of coal and gas and oil eventually. It's always a bit of an empirical question as to when, but the peak oil and the peak gas people tell me that we might have reached the peak already, and from now on it's all downhill. So it's clear that
the lights are going to turn off now and go to the dark ages. So.
Well, it's an empirical question as to how quickly this will happen, but it is clear that we have been living off the Earth's resources and will continue to do so because it's just the road of least resistance. But it's important to recognize that our interaction with the environment and growing economies in the environment has not been all bad. In many ways, the environment, in terms of whether it's sustainable, has actually benefited the last 20 to 30 years. So local rivers have been cleaned up almost throughout the Western and Asian worlds now, right? Salmon has been reintroduced in many European rivers, whereas they were too dirty 30, 40 years ago. Smog is an unheard of phenomenon. Asthmatic type things are no longer brought on so much by the dirt in the air, which used to be a lot more normal. And so at the local level, with conservation, nature parks, we now have sort of fisheries parks. We are getting better and better at preserving the things of nature which we think we need and we think are valuable and that we want to enjoy. And hence the capacity of nature to, as it were, provide things for us that we want doesn't really seem to have been affected that much. So if you want an empirical measure, biomass, which is sort of the total production of new stuff, is in fact not declined. So yes, it's true that we are raping the earth in the sense that it's all now for us, right? I mean, we've now got cows instead of endangered species, but it's still an animal, right? There's still nature in some degree.
So look, you mentioned the micro level, and I would agree with that, but at the global level, there are some challenges. And, it's not only global warming that gets all the attention, but, most economists don't actually read much physics. But one striking fact that I think should be mentioned here is that, if basically, as a mankind, we've been increasing the energy consumption, at a very linear rate, almost 3% per year. And the thing is that this obviously cannot continue. If you had that trend continuing, then the laws of thermodynamics imply that in something like 400 years, probably less, the surface temperature of the Earth is going to reach 100 degrees. And this has nothing to do with CO2. This is not, global warming. This is just the fact that if we use a lot of temperature, it's got to, through radiation, it's going to be released. And in fact, if you go about 1,000 years with this trend, we would reach the energy of the entire sun that we would be consuming here on Earth. So, future growth will have to be different. It cannot be as energy consuming as we've seen so far. Would you agree with that?
I would say that in the next coming 100 years or so, the world as a whole, and this is not a statement of how things should be, but how they will be, won't be bothered too much by this, I'm afraid. And the reason for that is very simple, that most of the decisions that are taken towards greater economic growth and greater wealth are not taken at a world level. They're not even taken by national politicians. They're taken by households, small regions, regional politicians, people who want a second car or who want their first car, people who want to build lives for their kids. And that is such a tremendous force, right? That wish to amass more goods, particularly on the side of people who don't amass.
That's the great part in your book, is it? Or?
It is a large part in the book, yes, that there is no real way in which we can coordinate at the world level to undo this. This is such a powerful force for more, and also an understandable force, right? Poor people wanting to get richer, rich people wanting to stay rich. And every election in the last 100 years that I can remember has almost been fought on the platform of more economic growth. So when push comes to shove, I'm sure all of us in this room still want economic growth. And against that reality, I don't think that there is truly a constituency at the world level to countervail this and sort of from some grand physicist level have less energy. But there's a lot to say about the trends, you say, right? So let me give you some sort of counter figures. At the moment, we only use about as much energy as 1/7,000th of what the sun hits us with every year. And hence there are also clear alternatives on the table. We already know that thermal from solar is cheap enough that we can in fact switch from fossil fuels to solar. We don't want to because it's more expensive. Read more jobs involved in generating it. But we will once we run out of cheap fossil fuels, right? There is a natural progression from the cheaper fuels to the more expensive fuels, and hence we've got alternatives already in line, which will keep us going for a long, long time, right? We can keep going for at least 100 years in just building more and more solar panels, which will get us to maybe 1/700th, right? 10 times the amount of energy we know now, without any problems. Yeah, so there is no real bottleneck yet.
This is the supply bit. The thing is that if you use the energy, it's gonna, it's gonna be released somehow. So even if we don't know where the energy comes from, and I agree that there might be good sources, then
sure. But I will make you the following prediction, which is that the politics of organizing a counter movement to all these micro people and all the politicians who want this, all the leaders who want this for their group, who are elected on the basis of getting more growth for them, are so hard, so intractable, and so easy to circumvent if there would be a general world rule in place, that I would only place my hope in engineers, right? I would tend to place my hope in asking a physicist, well, if I give you a budget of $1,000 billion, could you undo this warming somehow, right? Could you throw something in the air which would do it? Could you put something up in the skies? Can you make more clouds? Can you give me a filter? Can you bury the charcoal in the ground? It's basically geoengineering. And I would say there is more chance that that'll work than this kind of magic revelation of a political solution at the world level, and we'll all storm forwards and forget about the fact that we too are going to vote for growth next election again, and we all pretend that we're going to do this. Now, so far the last 20 years, we've pretended that we're going to do something. But on the ground, none of us are doing something, right? Almost none of us. So the pretense is so far from the reality that if you are an intellectual and care about what actually happens, as opposed to, just the feel good, let's move forward, you got to put your hope in something realistic. And these international treaties, I'm afraid, they're just dead ducks, right? These are circuses. They're made for our amusement, but they're not serious attempts to do something. And the serious attempts to do something are underway. There are now large research units trying to look at how we can geoengineer our way out of this. And people laugh at them who don't know, that this is our only chance, but there are also whole government departments now who see this as our only chance, and I'm with them.
Look, I agree with your skepticism about what can be done at the global level, and it should be said that there are major risks associated with geoengineering. But let us move on. We're actually running out of time. We've only scraped the surface of macroeconomics, which means that you might have to come back from Queensland to do part 2. But the thing that also people have in mind in terms of economic growth is that you need prices to increase. You need this inflation to fuel economic growth. What would you quickly say to those people?
For me, this is an entirely empirical question. So theoretically speaking, economists have a great difficulty working out why you would need inflation, right? In most of the ways in which we view an economy, it is in fact not so hard for some prices to go up and some prices to go down. And so it's more a question of looking at reality. Is it possible to have growth and no inflation? And I would say that the empirical reality has been that it is hard to have growth if you don't have a bit of inflation. And the real usefulness of inflation is that it makes it easier to change relative prices, right? It makes it easier for some people to earn less without them noticing too much that they earn less. And if you don't have inflation, if prices on average remain the same, then people notice much quicker whether or not they go down in their wages because their nominal wages drop, right? They see their take-home pay drop.
We're talking about wage rigidity.
It's wage rigidity, it's sort of nominal wage rigidity, and a sort of money illusion are associated with this. But you can see this phenomenon inside enterprises. So one of the stylized facts which goes along with this is that virtually no one, less than something like 1% of people take an hourly pay cut from one year to the next in an organization. The only way to do it is to fire them, because they get so upset if they realize that their wages are going down. But if inflation is 10% and they have the same nominal wage, they don't balk so much, they don't complain so much. So the same wage cut is organizable via an inflation level, which you can't organize by having their actual, take-home headline wages go down. So the coordination problem of prices, it just seems to be too hard for us to get growth and relative price changes which are necessary to adopt changing realities on the ground without inflation. So I would say a bit of inflation is a good thing, right? You do want bouts of inflation, but hyperinflation is also empirically noticeable to be very, very bad. So you don't want inflation in the hundreds of percent, but if you've got a couple of years of higher inflation, just below the 2 digits, say, that is not generally a problem. That can in fact be healthy. And particularly in Europe now, there are lots of voices, and I would be amongst them, who'd say that we need a bit of inflation, right? That'd be good to get rid of all these debts.
So these are called sometimes the grease effects. Also, that you kind of greasing the wheels of the economy by allowing these adjustments. That's why most central banks have an inflation target around the 2% mark rather than a 0% mark. But let's just, I think we're rapidly running out of time. And we've got lots of issues to discuss. So unfortunately, I might have to pass it on to the audience, or fortunately, for questions. Are there any questions that you would like to ask? If anyone...
I'll ask a question. Just going back to what you said about like the global warming situation, do you ever feel that perhaps one day if we were to have like a bureaucracy of a world order, that would be possible politically? And what do you predict the future of that sort of situation as being?
Well, either you've read one of my first blogs on this, or you're uncannily aware of what is in this new book of mine, An Economic Theory of Greed, Love, Groups and Networks. So the first part of your question is, do I see a bureaucracy like that emerging and could it work? I would say yes. In a world empire, if you like, the ability to as it were, reduce economic growth and to push at all levels is a lot easier. Because one of the reasons that economic growth is so sacred in our societies is because we are status seekers. We want our country to do well relative to other countries. Right? We don't want to be the schmucks who have a losing economy and other places doing well. If we find that, then we move abroad as young, ambitious people. So it's just not possible to organize it at the decentralized level. So could a bureaucracy succeed where coordination between countries can't? Yes, it could. Can I see it happen though? Not easily. I have tried for many years to think of a scenario in which we would get at a world government. But I can't realistically see anybody giving up their own sovereign power for this world government. Because in order to implement something as big as climate change regulation, you have to have an international police. You have to have people actually going into factories everywhere and putting in heavy fines in other countries. Now that is pure sovereignty, right? You need this almost kind of a mobile army going into countries. Now, I can't see countries giving that up. They just don't care enough about global warming for that. And I can't see something else for which they care either enough. So as an empirical question, do you think we're going to get there? No. What would the world look like with this global bureaucracy? I would say it's an empire, right? It naturally leads to centralization. And one of the great myths that you see within the global warming debate, and you see as a fantasy of scientists, is that you can have a global bureaucracy which controls everything, right? Which controls the economy, which controls all factors of production, environment, all that, big brother, but it would be benevolent, right? It would be run by super smart scientists like themselves, and they would only be concerned with saving the environment, right? This would be a world bank. But that's a fantasy. They'd be our bosses. We'd be their slaves.
For centuries, there's been philosophers trying to work out how to effectively run the government. I mean, we had
it's
Plato's.
It's pure fascism. It's pure fascism, and it would lead to fascism again. It would lead to the worst type of government.
Well, I mean, there are kind of sensible suggestions like Plato's Republic, but again, it's not.
But that was his fantasy of him running a republic, right? I mean, think of it. Plato's Republic was about we should let people in charge who, like me, accidentally enough, has been learning for 40 years. They should basically be the ones who tell everybody else what to do. That is a wank, right? It's another technical term. I mean, it really is this fantasy which some people have that they would be nice if you let them in charge of everybody, whereas not. Power corrupts, and they corrupt Plato too.
I agree. I mean,
so it's one of the worst pieces of drivel ever written, the Republic, as far as I'm concerned. He's so naive, right? But it's this fantasy that, there are these great people out there whom you can trust to do the right thing, and if only we put all the world's resources in their hands, things will be fine. This is a terrible fantasy. It's very dangerous.
Can we maybe have another question here?
My question is on global financial crisis. America was one of the countries who suffered the most from it, but it created the money and paid out its debts and loans. If countries like America can do it, then why not countries like Pakistan, who is still now suffering from the burden of interest paid by American governments? So my question is about, is there any watchdog for creating money, or rules, regulation, or in the general law?
Now, I must admit, I know very little about Pakistan, apart from a little bit about sort of its history. But I don't know well how it's done under the global financial crisis. But I think it's fair to say that the worries of Pakistan won't count for much in the corridors of power in either the EU, the US, or in the World Bank and the IMF, right? So it's sort of a political non-entity at that world economic level. So their interests are not really represented. I think that would be a fair thing to say. Now, as to whether there is something to be said for money printing, definitely. But money printing will have many unexpected effects for different countries. So if America would print more money, it's actually printing money at the moment, then that means more inflation in America, and it means that everybody who holds American debt, like American bonds, suddenly finds that those dollars are worth less, right? They can buy less with it. And who loses out? Well, everybody loses out who has those American bonds. And a great example of that is China, which holds a large proportion of these American bonds. So if America prints money, it is in effect stealing from China. And of course, this is great for America, and they shouldn't worry about this, and they don't. Right? The Chinese should be worried about this, but one of the geopolitical facts is that they don't seem to be too worried about this, right?
They're still buying.
They are still buying.
Bonds.
But that's a geopolitical reason, right? They sort of don't want America to collapse, and hence are not selling off their bonds the same at the rate that they should, perhaps for economic reasons. So these are sort of deep strategic reasons why it doesn't happen. But yes, a little bit of inflation is probably on the cards. The Fed is clearly gearing towards that, and in EU too, there are more and more voices to urge the European Central Bank on to printing more money. And one of the latest plans is something that I would say is close to printing more money, which is hence buying in fairly worthless bonds from some European countries, which you know will never be paid back, but you're sending them good money. So that's also a form of money printing. And that is generically recognized as one of the few ways in which Europe can get more quickly out of the debt crisis, which is just print more money, get more inflation, so that all these debts are worth less, so that they are less a burden on future developments.
Yeah, is there any other question? I was going to ask you, now that another question here.
You talked about the Chinese economy quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any foreseeable obstacles you see the Chinese economy having, whether they be an aging population, inflation, or even like the environmental problems that have been created by the recent surge in growth?
Well, I've been to China a couple of times, and the thing that struck me is not just how real their growth is, right? For a long time, there were development economists pretending that it didn't happen, that somehow the Chinese were inventing a growing economy in the books, but it didn't happen. But it really is happening, right? You can see the buildings going up, you can see the bullet trains being made, you can see the new schools in effect, you can see the degree to which the whole population is learning more about English. You can see the growth of the cities, you can see the emptying of the countryside, the production boom. You can just look at the imports and exports. So it's really happening, and there are no major obstacles that you can see for at least the next 10 years. Because everything which you would want to put in their growth are still areas where they can improve a lot. So their education can improve leaps and bounds. They have hardly any university-educated people, right? But they've just in the last 10 years or so started building a lot more universities. Now, these still have to fill up, and they've got to build more of them.
The same way as the ghost cities that are kind of...
the ghost cities, yes. There are lots and lots of regional cities yet to go. There's only a 50% urbanization in China, whereas a country like Australia is 30% more urbanized. We're about 80% urbanized. So there's all that growth to come from all the people from the countryside who are yet to go into the cities. So there is the manpower there. Then the electricity clearly can be generated, right? They're building something like 2 coal-fired power stations a week, which tells you how serious they are with global warming. Right? If you just look at their actions rather than their words, they're just like us, right? They vote for growth too.
But they'll be more negatively affected than most other countries.
That's not clear. No, I've seen some food projections which say that they, in fact, will see their agricultural production go up. So it's not clear at all that China will lose out. It's more the cities on the coast side which may have to put up more dikes. But that's a discussion for another day. But in terms of the electricity barriers, the energy barriers, they don't seem to be there population-wise. Technologically also, a lot of their manufacturing is sort of 60s, 70s, 80s type manufacturing, and that can still improve beyond bounds, right? They have not yet become as IT dense as the US is. They've not really started yet with the innovation sector, and I think that the Chinese could actually be pretty good at that once they get their minds to it. Politically too, it's very stable politically. There's no real problems on the horizon yet. Right? So I can't see the barrier. I'm very optimistic about Chinese growth the next 20 years. After 20 years, I think it's over, right? Then they're sort of at the level at which I think they'll flatten out. But I can't see them.
Okay, well, maybe just one quick question.
Just quickly, in terms of crash course in first year macroeconomics, what are the 5 or 6 main threshold concepts you think need to be in a macroeconomics course for students?
Threshold concepts. What do you mean by threshold concepts?
The ones that, if they don't kind of grasp them, they can't really get a grasp on the further, more complicated concepts of economics as they go forward in their studies.
Okay. So I would say that there are 3 main things that they would have to get their head round to really be able to grasp macro. I would say you have to get your head around the notion of equilibrium, right, which is the Central European, the central economic concept by which economists look at the whole macroeconomy, which is hence this notion that we are forever going towards a place in which all opportunities are taken. We'll never go there, but it's a place we're moving towards, because it's such a powerful concept in terms of saying, where are we going to, right? What is going to happen? And also, what should legislation then be about, right? It's much easier to understand legislation if you understand equilibrium, right? So equilibrium is a very important concept, and it's not so easy to get your head around. It sounds easy, but it's not, because it requires you to think through as to, okay, what would greedy people do if they got more opportunities, if I changed the laws? Oh, that would happen, okay. You've actually got to think quite a few steps. So the whole concept of equilibrium is one of my key 3 ones for macro. I would say creative destruction is also a very important concept. So the concept of creative destruction are that new things come along all the time which require you to adapt, to change, and to find more information, to find new trading partners. And that notion that at every level there are, as it were, shocks to the system, which create, as it were, a new equilibrium, which create a new place towards we are moving, is very important to get your head around, because that is what explains everything to do with information. It's what explains everything to do with, well, why are there entrepreneurs? It explains everything to do with unemployment, right? Unemployed people are basically people who are not matched, who sort of have had a productive match before, but who still need to be connected to other people who might have had just, new technologies only just came around the corner. So it helps you know the whole world of search, the whole world of information, and a lot of our economic institutions are about creative destructions, if you think about it, or about allowing that dynamism. And the third thing, and probably the hardest thing you got to get your head around, is money. Right? Money is an invention. Money is this weird piece of paper or a bank account we give each other, and we trust that somehow this will be worth something if we go to another person. And as soon as there is money, there is abuse of money, because someone can print that piece of paper and they can print lots more of it, and hence sort of cheating us. But also, if you are a bank and there's lots of money flowing through that's not yours, you can in various ways steal from that bit of money. And the whole global financial crisis can best be understood as people abusing their position of power inside financial institutions as well. They've got these hundreds of billions of dollars flowing through their institutions. They're not theirs, but they can use them. They can borrow against them. They can gamble with them. If they win big on the stock market, they get part of the benefits. If they lose, it's not their money. Someone else loses. So the whole financial system hangs on an understanding of money. And that is the toughest one to get your head around, as to how money actually works and to how you can steal from money if it goes through your institution. And I would say, if I had to be self-critical about economics, money is the one we understand least well, because it's too hard to model. We don't have micro models of money which make any sense or are useful. And so it really is the toughest one of the 3, I would say. The other 2 been debated for a long time. We feel we've got our heads around it, but money is just so tough to get your head around.
Well, from the answer, you actually see that Paul's take on economics is quite different from the standard kind of line. And you wrote a first-year textbook as well. It's here. It's called Introductory Economics for Decision Makers. So those of you who want to explore more of Paul's ideas, you're welcome to check it out. Now, thank you very much, Paul. I was interested to find out on your website, when you're discussing your research interest, you talk about trying to understand the unanswerable economic mysteries in life. And I would very much like to thank you for sharing some of your insights into these economic mysteries with us and your time as well. So please join me in thanking Paul for a very interesting talk. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Jan.
Okay.
Thanks for
And
the invite.
hope to see
It's been
you
a
back.
pleasure.
Hope to see you back soon for part 2.
We clearly need to do many more parts.
Thank you.